रब इश्रह ली सदरी व यस्सिर ली अमरी वाहलुल उक़दतम मिन लिसानी यफ़क़हू क़ौली अऊज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम अस्सलामु अलैकुम. Let's start the brief explanation of the 21st para with a dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us to understand it and implement it in our lives. Ameen. Surah Al-Ankabut continues in the 21st para. The first verse of this para gives us some important instructions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, recite, O Prophet, what is revealed to you of the book and establish prayer. Surely prayer restrains one from shameful and evil act. Indeed, remembrance of Allah is the greatest of all things. Allah knows what you do. Remember that this surah started with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us that we will be tested. Now here in verse 45, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us some tips on how to pass these tests. What are these tips? Recite the Quran and establish prayer. Quran is our manual given to us from our Creator. It has everything we need to function at optimum level, and it has solutions to all our problems. What does prayer do? Prayer is the energy by which we recharge our souls and our iman. Our daily hassles and problems drain our batteries, and when we disconnect from everything and connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are re-energized, right? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that establishing prayer stops us from shameful and evil acts. But why doesn't our prayer stop us from doing wrong? Because we are just praying and not establishing prayers. It means my prayer has not yet been established, as it's still under construction. Now how well and how strong my construction is depends upon me. Another command comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in verse 46. It says, and do not debate with the people of the book unless it is in the best manner. All discussions about religion should be done in a rational, civilized and decent manner. Our purpose should not be to make the other person lose, but to win heart. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 56, my believing servants, my earth is vast, so worship me and me alone. This verse is a hint towards the first hijrah, which had not yet happened when this surah was revealed. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Muslims of Makkah and all believers that if you feel it is becoming difficult for you to follow Islam in your city or country, you may leave it and move to another place where you can live as true believers. This surah concludes with verse 69, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises His pleasure and guidance to those who strive in His way. Surah Ar-Rum. Let's take a look at the flow chart of the microstructure of Surah Ar-Rum, which was revealed in the 5th year of prophethood in Makkah. The surah begins with the prediction of the victory of the Romans over the superpowers of that time, Persians. This was done 9 years before the event happened, and the Roman Empire was near its downfall. A few years later, the Romans defeated the Persians and took back their land. That same year, the Muslims were victorious at Badr. So, both the predictions from the Quran came true. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 5, He gives victory whoever He wills, for He is the Almighty, most merciful. Starting from verse 8, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us a list of signs within ourselves and spread in the universe, which prove that there will be a life after death. In verse 21, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, one of His signs is that He has created mates for you from your own kind, that you may find peace in them, and He has set between you love and mercy. Surely there are signs in this for those who reflect. This verse teaches us why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created mates and how they can have a successful marriage. We all have our ideals of what a successful marriage should be like, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us successful marriage is one where there is peace, where both spouses give and receive love and mercy from each other. So our spouses are basically a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 30, O Prophet and his followers, turn your face single-mindedly to the true faith and adhere to the true nature of what Allah has created human beings. The mold fashioned by Allah cannot be altered. That is the true straight faith, although most people do not know. Us humans have been pre-programmed by Allah ta'ala with an operating system that has loaded basic human values and morals in all of us. It is our fitra or true nature that we believe and worship our Creator. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us not to fight our true nature and firmly follow the straight path, that is Islam. Then we are ordered in verse 38, so give your close relatives their due as well as the poor and the needy traveler. That is best for those who seek the pleasure of Allah, and it is they who will be successful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to know that if you want to please Him, then please His people by giving them their right. Surah Luqman. Let's take a look at the flow chart of the microstructure of Surah Luqman, which was revealed in the 5th year of prophethood in Makkah. Surah Luqman focuses on the story of Luqman the wise and his advice to his son. Luqman's word of wisdom were famous among the Arabs, In this surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds the Arabs that Luqman's message was the same as the message of Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 12, "Indeed, we bless Luqman with wisdom, saying, be grateful to Allah for whoever is grateful, it is only for their own good. And whoever is ungrateful, then surely Allah is self-sufficient, praiseworthy." We are told that Luqman was wise because he had been given wisdom from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the first demand of wisdom is gratefulness and obedience before his Lord. Point to note is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need of our gratitude. Our gratitude is beneficial for our own selves. The Quran then mentions the advice which Luqman gave to his son. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala liked his advice so much that he has preserved it in the Quran. The first advice is, "O my dear son, never associate anything with Allah in worship, for associating others with him is truly the worst of all wrongs." The first lesson for us in this verse is how he addresses his son. "O my beloved son." How do we talk to our children? Do we speak with them with love and respect, or do we only mistreat them and talk to them harshly because we are superior than them? The first advice that he gives his son is not to do shirk. Every believer, even from a young age, should be taught that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone is our master, possessor of all power. The second advice comes in verse 14, "And we have commanded people to honor their parents. Their mothers bore them through hardship upon hardship, and their weaning takes 2 years. So be grateful to me and your parents. To me is the final return." After the right of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala comes the rights of parents. And among parents, the mother comes first. Most of us don't remember the hardships our mother bore for us when we were small, right? And our fathers, they worked hard day and night to provide for us. They counsel us and advise us. And for this, they deserve our respect and honor. Then Luqman says in verse 16, "O my dear son, even if a deed were the weight of a mustard seed, be it hidden in a rock or in the heavens or the earth, Allah will bring it forth. Surely Allah is most subtle, all aware." Luqman teaches his son that nothing is hidden from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You cannot do anything good or bad, anywhere or any time, which may remain hidden from Allah. He is not only aware of it, but when the time for accountability comes, He will place before you a full record of each act of yours. So stay away from sins. In the next verse, Luqman gives his son 4 instructions. Establish prayer, enjoin what is right, forbid what is wrong, and be patient over what happens to you. In verse 19, he teaches son how to walk and talk. He says, "And be moderate in your pace, and lower your voice. Indeed, the most disagreeable of sounds is the voice of donkeys." It's not enough to be just good from the inside. The outside is also important. Our body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, all make or break our personality. When we study the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we see how cultured and humble he was. His walk and talk were both calm and dignified. People loved spending time in his company, and to become like him should be our goal too. This was the timeless and sincere advice from a loving father to his son. I hope we too advise our children in this manner and become the first ones to instill these habits in ourselves. Surah As-Sajdah. Let's take a look at the flow chart of the microstructure of Surah As-Sajdah, which was revealed in the 4th or 5th year of prophethood in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is the belief in life after death. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts the surah with an introduction to himself. The revelation of this book is beyond doubt from the Lord of all worlds. Many surahs start in a similar manner. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to pay attention from the very start that this message is being issued by the ruler of the universe and not some ordinary human. If you choose to accept this message, then know that you will have to obey its commands. Then from verse 4 to 9, the many signs of the majesty and power of the ruler of the universe are shown to us. In verse 12, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the conditions of sinners on the day of judgment. If only you could see the wicked hanging their heads in shame before their Lord, crying, "Our Lord, we have now seen and heard, so send us back and we will do good." We truly have sure faith now. That day their declaration of faith will be of no use. They will have already failed the test, which was to believe while the reality was hidden. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs us about the attitude of the believers. We are told in verse 15, the only true believers in our revelation are those who, when it is recited to them, fall into prostration and glorify the praises of their Lord and are not too proud. These are the qualities of the believers. They listen and they surrender. They do not regard it beneath their dignity to submit their will in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What else do? They abandon their beds, invoking their Lord with hope and fear, and donate from what we have provided for them. Their nights are spent in gaining the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are regular in their tahajjud prayers, and they spend from whatever little or much that they have. Do we also have these qualities? Do we submit our will to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Do we always praise Him? Do we leave our sleep for His sake? Do we spend to earn His pleasure? Think about it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 18, is the one who is a believer equal before Allah to the one who is rebellious? They are not equal. These are two different attitudes, and the results will also be totally different. One will gain the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and will be rewarded accordingly, and the other, they will be the ones who will be punished for their crimes. This brings us to the end of our lesson for today and to the question I'm going to ask myself. The question is, which advice from Surah Al-Luqman do I really need to use so I can be a better person? Inshallah, we will meet again tomorrow with the next para. Allah Hafiz.